She didn't just kill her parents. She rewrote the rules of power in blood. And for over a century, you've been told a bedtime version of her story, sanitized, diluted, and scrubbed clean. But tonight, we're peeling it back. The real Lizzie Borden wasn't a mystery. She was a message. Fall River, 1892. A time soaked in sweat, soot, and secrets. Behind lace curtains and Protestant restraint, something ancient stirred. You were taught that Lizzie Borden was an anomaly, a disturbed young woman who snapped in a moment of rage. But what if I told you she didn't snap? What if I told you she awakened? This isn't just about a double murder. This is about a daughter who watched power shift away from her, who felt legacy slip through her fingers like water, who studied how the world treated men with violence and women with silence, and then made a decision that would echo through American history. Because Lizzie didn't live in the world you and I inherited. She lived in the world that built ours, a world where women were property, where bloodlines were everything, where inheritance wasn't just money, it was control. Understand this. Fall River wasn't just a mill town, it was a breeding ground for suppression. Industrial titans and dead-eyed clergy controlled every thought, every whisper, every inheritance. And Lizzie, she was born into the middle of that web, between tradition and rebellion, obedience and possession. But power doesn't beg for freedom, it takes it. And so, one stifling summer morning, in a home where emotion was outlawed and truth was a threat, Lizzie Borden didn't lose her mind. She declared war, and the question we must ask isn't whether she did it. It's why no one wanted her to be guilty, because what she revealed wasn't just a crime, it was a crack in the illusion, a reminder that beneath polished wood and family portraits there is a hunger that no era, no law, and no name can restrain. This isn't a tale of madness, it's a manual, and if you listen closely you'll realize. The house on 2nd Street never burned down, it just changed its address. Lizzie Borden wasn't born into darkness, she was forged in it. The Borden home was a structure of order, rules without affection, routine without tenderness. Every creaking floorboard, every ticking wall clock in that house pulsed with a single command, obey. And Lizzie, she obeyed, for a time. Her father, Andrew Borden, was a titan of frugality, a man so obsessed with control he refused to install indoor plumbing despite being one of the wealthiest men in Fall River. His thrift wasn't virtue, it was domination, a daily reminder to his wife and daughters that even comfort had to be earned through silence. But Lizzie wasn't silent, not completely. She joined the church, she taught Sunday school, she smiled in public. But behind her eyes, there was calculation, a boiling awareness that she was not a daughter, she was a pawn. Abby Borden, the stepmother, was never truly mother. The daughters called her Mrs. Borden even after 20 years in the family. That wasn't passive aggression, that was tactical distance. Lizzie saw Abby not as a nurturer, but as a rival, an intruder. And when whispers of a revised will began to surface, one that would shift the family estate into Abby's bloodline, something ancient stirred in Lizzie's bones. See, society loves a silent woman, a compliant woman, but it fears a woman who studies patterns, a woman who asks, "Who benefits if I disappear?" Lizzie asked, and she found no answer that didn't end with her erased. She understood what most people still refuse to admit. Inheritance isn't about love, it's about lineage, blood, access. And Abby was siphoning that access into a future where Lizzie and her sister Emma would be left with nothing. Imagine standing in your own home, knowing every piece of furniture, every nail, every dollar was built by your father's labor, but destined for someone else's bloodline. That isn't injustice. That's erasure. And for a woman like Lizzie, sharp, aware, trapped, it was an existential death. And in Fall River, women didn't leave. They were kept, hidden away, slowly decaying into the wallpaper of their fathers' homes. Lizzie saw it in her neighbors, in her sister, in herself. And she made a decision that the world still pretends was madness, but no mad woman ever cleaned that carefully. No mad woman ever waited for the scream to fall silent before she stepped forward. Understand this, the axe wasn't just a weapon, it was punctuation. A full stop on the rules that governed her life. You see, Lizzie didn't murder to escape. She murdered to claim, to inherit, to ascend. And that makes everyone deeply uncomfortable because we're taught that women kill for emotion, not strategy. But Lizzie planned. She waited, and most terrifying of all, she smiled. The day of the killings, August 4th, 1892, was thick with heat and tension. But what happened inside that house wasn't a burst of chaos. It was theater, rehearsed, controlled. She waited for the servants to be outside. She waited for her stepmother to be isolated, and when she struck, it wasn't rage, it was ritual. 19 blows to her father, 11 to Abby. That's not frantic, that's sacred. You've been told it was a crime of passion, but passion doesn't hide bloodied dresses in the basement. Passion doesn't reposition bodies. Passion doesn't wash the axe in the kitchen basin like a surgeon preparing for inspection. But power? Power cleanses. Power hides. Power controls the narrative. And Fall River, well, it needed a narrative, a simple one, because if Lizzie Borden could do this, then no home was safe, no daughter predictable, no lineage secure. So the city, the papers, the courts, they all whispered the same thing. She couldn't have done this. She was too quiet, too plain, too good. But let me tell you what they refused to see. She was invisible, and invisibility is the perfect camouflage. When you're a woman in a world that only values your silence, your greatest weapon is being underestimated. Lizzie knew they'd doubt her. That's why she cried on cue, why she fainted in court, why she looked the jury in the eye and said, "I loved my father." She knew they'd believe the lie because it was easier than facing the truth. That sometimes the monster doesn't break in through the window. Sometimes she's already inside, wearing white gloves, pouring tea, waiting. So I ask you this, not as a viewer but as a man who's beginning to see beneath the surface. What if everything you were taught about innocence, about family, about power, was designed to keep you tame? This is the first crack. And Lizzie Borden's story, it's not a cautionary tale. It's a template. The autopsies were a nightmare written in flesh. Skulls cracked like porcelain, spines twisted unnaturally. This wasn't just murder, it was humiliation. A display. Abby Borden's body was found face down in the guest bedroom, her head nearly split in two. Blood soaked the carpet like ink from a broken secret. Andrew, the patriarch, was slumped on the sitting room couch. His face, no longer a face, just ruin, as if someone had tried to erase his identity from the world entirely. And yet, no fingerprints, no bloody footprints, no witness to the act. Just silence, stillness. And Lizzie, untouched. She claimed she was in the barn searching for fishing sinkers in the middle of a sweltering August day. No dust on her boots, no sweat on her brow, just calm, controlled, as if her alibi had been rehearsed for weeks. But the town didn't want to see it. Not really. Because Lizzie Borden was the daughter of a rich man, a church-going spinster, white, educated, and when those elements combine, society doesn't see danger, it sees virtue. But the jury wasn't blind, they were terrified. Because what Lizzie represented wasn't just a possible killer, she was proof that evil can wear civility like a mask, that brutality can be wrapped in lace and prayer books. And if Lizzie could kill with such precision, so could others. Daughters, wives, sisters. That threat, internal, domestic, feminine, shattered the Victorian illusion of safety. And so, rather than confront it, the court chose denial. They let her walk, acquitted, free. But no one who came out of that courtroom believed she was innocent, not truly, and Lizzie knew it. She returned home a pariah, but a powerful one, unapologetic. She named her house Maplecroft, a new fortress, bigger than the old one. Built not with her father's permission, but with his blood-soaked inheritance. She bought fine furniture, hosted parties, wrote letters. She became a myth in her own lifetime. And what do you call someone who builds her legacy atop the corpses of her enemies? Not a criminal, an architect. Because Lizzie wasn't just reshaping her own life, she was redefining the boundaries of womanhood, control, and vengeance. The Victorian world couldn't comprehend her, so it turned her into a rhyme, a nursery jingle, a ghost story. But make no mistake, Lizzie Borden wasn't a ghost. She was a mirror. And what you saw in her reflection was the part of yourself the world told you to bury. You think monsters wear fangs. They don't. They wear brooches. They serve breakfast. They speak softly in parlors with ticking clocks and lace curtains. That's what made Lizzie dangerous. Not just what she did, but how well she blended in. By the time she stood trial in 1893, the machinery of reputation had already begun turning in her favor. Newspapers painted her as delicate, misunderstood. Friends testified she was incapable of violence. The courtroom filled with townsfolk who simply couldn't accept the idea that a woman, a respectable woman, could commit such intimate savagery. But here's the unspoken truth. Lizzie didn't fight the story. She guided it. She sat in court dressed in black silk, eyes lowered just enough to appear mournful, but not broken. Her composure, unshakable. When they unveiled the skulls of her parents as evidence, placed them on a table in front of her, Lizzie didn't scream. She fainted. On cue. Not from horror, but strategy. Because when you're dealing with a system built by men, for men, the surest way to win is to weaponize their expectations. Lizzie knew this, and in a world where women were expected to be weak, she used weakness as armor. Her innocence became performance art. But let me ask you, who taught her that? This level of cunning doesn't grow in a vacuum. It's inherited, trained, groomed by the same society that later pretended to be shocked. Her father, Andrew Borden, was a man obsessed with control. He ruled the household with discipline, withheld money, emotions, and comfort. He believed his daughters owed him obedience, not affection. So Lizzie learned early. Love is a transaction. Power must be taken, not given. And when the inheritance lines were threatened, when whispers of a will surfaced that favored her stepmother, Lizzie did what any apprentice of power does. She eliminated the problem, and made sure the system applauded her for surviving it. Because after all the blood, all the headlines, and all the theater, Lizzie didn't just walk free, she walked taller, as if daring the world to accuse her again. But what if I told you that wasn't the end of her story? What if the murders were merely the beginning? Because Maplecroft didn't just become her home, it became her lab. A place where something darker began to take root, something more calculated than revenge, and in the years that followed, more people would disappear. But no one ever connected the dots, because they were all still staring at the axe, while Lizzie was already holding the scalpel. You were told the story ends with the trial, that Lizzie Borden walked free and faded into obscurity. But that's not what happened. She moved into a grand home on French Street, Maplecroft, a 3-story Victorian fortress with stained glass windows, carved wood interiors, and a private library. It was not a retreat. It was a statement. She didn't leave Fall River. She conquered it. While the city whispered, Lizzie hosted. While others avoided her, she leaned in, inviting suspicion with a grin. She began collecting strange books, medical texts, and diaries from condemned women. Her home filled with symbols, Egyptian charms, mirrors turned inward, and locked rooms even her servants weren't allowed to enter. She wasn't hiding. She was evolving. Neighbors spoke of strange music late at night, of foreign visitors arriving at odd hours, and of smells, sterile one day, sulfur the next. People assumed she was simply eccentric, wounded by trauma. But those who knew how to look saw something else. A pattern. Because after 1893, unexplained deaths began cropping up in Fall River. Servants who went missing, travelers who checked into boarding houses and never left, a neighbor girl whose body was found posed in a nearby creek, arms folded, eyes closed, as if laid out for burial. No charges, no investigations, just silence. Lizzie's name never came up, because Lizzie had learned the most valuable lesson of all: never strike from the shadows unless you own the light. She kept the press on her side, donating to hospitals, churches, even animal shelters. Every story about her focused on her loneliness, her grief, her tragic past. But behind closed doors, she was writing, diaries no one was allowed to read, letters to women's prisons asking for interviews with inmates convicted of poisoning their husbands, handwritten medical notes about nerve pressure points and asphyxiation. And this wasn't nostalgia. This was research. She wasn't a criminal anymore. She was a student of silence, of manipulation, of pain. And inside Maplecroft, she wasn't the girl on trial. She wasn't the daughter or the victim or the mourning heiress. She was something new, something that studied your weaknesses while serving you tea. She didn't just get away with murder. She turned it into a method. And those who got too close, they didn't vanish suddenly. They were unraveled, quietly. Let me tell you something few dare to admit. Lizzie Borden wasn't alone. Maplecroft became a sanctuary, not for grieving but for gathering. Over time, a pattern emerged. Women who had been cast out, labeled hysterical, dangerous, or unnatural, began appearing at her doorstep. A nurse who had been dismissed for euthanizing a patient, a schoolteacher accused of inappropriate discipline, a midwife from Boston whose clients always seemed to die in childbirth. They all found a home at Maplecroft. And Lizzie? She didn't call them servants. She called them sisters. Behind those heavy velvet curtains, something ancient was stirring. Not a cult, not a coven, but something far more subversive, a network, a communion of women trained in silence, in seduction, in shadow. They didn't believe in curses. They believed in leverage, in control, in understanding the rules of a man's world, then quietly, systematically rewriting them. You thought this was about one woman. It never was. This was an incubator. The house on French Street became a whisper in high society, a warning in the servant class. Parents told their sons to avoid it. Ministers told their flocks to pray for it. But no one touched it. No one dared. Because those who did, they forgot themselves. A constable who investigated a noise complaint at Maplecroft resigned 3 days later, unable to explain why. A local reporter who tried to interview Lizzie vanished. When his body was found months later in New Bedford, his mouth had been sewn shut, with his own hair. Coincidence or message? Understand the game Lizzie was playing. Not revenge, not insanity. Influence. She weaponized the very things society used to dismiss her: fragility, politeness, beauty, grief. She learned that the most dangerous woman isn't the one who lashes out, it's the one who listens, watches, waits. And when the world isn't looking, she reconstructs it. So, when you think about Lizzie Borden, don't picture the trial. Don't picture the axe. Picture this: a circle of women around a long oak table, candlelight flickering, voices calm and measured, not plotting violence but strategy. How to move, how to manipulate, how to remain unseen. Because if history remembers Lizzie Borden as a monster, that's exactly what she wanted. They called it Maplecroft, but within its walls it was known by another name: the vessel. Not a house, a chamber, a sanctum of control, of memory, of quietly coded rituals designed not for worship, but for power transference. You see, Lizzie never intended to clear her name. She intended to rewrite the nature of guilt itself. She understood something primal, that fear, when harnessed, doesn't push people away. It pulls them in. And she used Maplecroft as a testing ground. Every guest was observed, every conversation noted, letters opened, rewritten, resealed, servants rotated weekly, not to ensure privacy, but to limit familiarity. There was no trust, only roles, only positions in a structure no one else could see. What emerged was not chaos. It was a blueprint. Lizzie began compiling something she called the Velvet Ledger, a black-bound volume that catalogued human frailty, betrayal thresholds, inheritance disputes, marital manipulation, child coercion, even subtle poisoning techniques that mimicked natural causes. But it wasn't about murder. It was about compliance. She was building a system of psychological engineering rooted in quiet rituals, words, scents, gestures, intended to dismantle a person's will without ever laying a hand on them. And it worked. There's record, buried in sealed court files, of a banker's wife who spent one evening at Maplecroft, then transferred her husband's fortune the following week, of a reverend who lobbied for Lizzie's inclusion on the Women's Reform Board after just a single dinner. Coincidence? Or did she learn how to say what needed to be said, with the right tone, at the right time, in the right room? Because Lizzie wasn't studying murder anymore. She was studying conversion. How to break someone's narrative from the inside. How to undo reality without drawing blood. How to make a man believe the idea to hang himself was his own. She wasn't interested in justice. She was interested in legacy. And so the vessel remained, curtains drawn, candles lit, a fireplace always burning. Visitors came and went. Most forgot what they saw, but all of them, left different than when they entered, because they weren't guests. They were subjects. And Lizzie? She wasn't hiding from the world anymore. She was quietly, methodically rewiring it. There are pages of the velvet ledger that have no ink, just indentations, scratches, symbols that resemble musical notes bent into unfamiliar patterns. And on the last page, a name crossed out in red wax. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, the only true witness, the only one who could have seen what really happened that morning in 1892. She testified, but only just enough. She answered questions, but never fully. She left Fall River soon after, moved to Montana, changed her name, vanished from public life. But what if she didn't run? What if she was silenced without force? Because Lizzie's genius wasn't in covering her tracks, it was in convincing others to erase their own memories. That's what Maplecroft taught her. That's what the ledger recorded. How to speak in ways that disrupted cognition. How to rearrange the past while sitting across a parlor table sipping tea. This isn't fantasy. Modern psychological warfare, coercive interrogation tactics, memory implantation, linguistic reframing, mirror Lizzie's methods almost exactly, but she didn't study psychology. She studied people, and more disturbingly, she kept diagrams. One chart showed a dinner seating plan, 8 guests, each one labeled not by name, but by weakness. Envy, control, shame, lust, isolation, obedience, want, doubt. In the center, Lizzie. She wasn't just a participant in society. She was running an experiment on it. When a society rejects you, you have 2 options: fade or infiltrate. And Lizzie infiltrated in silence. She began mentoring women, wealthy widows, reformers, socialites, under the guise of philanthropy. But these were not benevolent gatherings. They were initiation trials. Guests were tested, observed, measured for malleability. Some were never invited back. Others became something else. It's said a woman named Marion Nichols came to Maplecroft for guidance after her husband's mysterious death. A year later, she hosted her own gatherings, mirroring Lizzie's down to the exact brand of wine and sequence of candle lighting. A network began forming, quiet, feminine, unseen, but not powerless, because they didn't seek votes, or laws, or titles. They sought access to secrets, to heirs, to rooms where real power lived and breathed. And Lizzie? She didn't just survive the trial of 1893. She weaponized it. She was no longer a suspect. She was a symbol, a quiet mother of something far more dangerous than crime, influence without permission. And it all started with one ledger and a name scratched in wax. Fall River changed after 1893, but not in the way people expected. You'd think a town shaken by 2 brutal murders would retreat inward, lock its doors, trust no one. But instead, there was a silence, a thick, almost reverent silence, like the town itself was holding its breath. Lizzie Borden walked its streets, not as a criminal nor a pariah, but something else. A relic, a myth still alive. She became a regular at the opera, hosted teas, donated to charities. She even funded the construction of a library wing. People started calling her Miss Lizzie again, softened, careful, polite. But behind that civility was something far more unsettling, fear disguised as admiration. Because everyone who mattered in Fall River knew one truth. Lizzie had done it. They just couldn't prove it. Or worse, they didn't want to. Power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a smile, a pressed dress, and offers you brandy from a cut crystal decanter. What people feared wasn't just the past. It was the possibility that Lizzie had learned how to bend the future. Let's revisit the Maplecroft gatherings. Each week a new guest, always women, always from wealth, and always unmarried or widowed. They were drawn in by Lizzie's intelligence, her charm, her promise of independence without shame. But these weren't feminist salons. These were rituals, choreographed evenings, candlelight arranged in prime-numbered groupings, Latin phrases passed as jokes, mirrors turned to face the wall. And always, before anyone left, a gift, a small velvet box, each one unique. Inside, sometimes a brooch, sometimes a scrap of burned parchment, sometimes a page from an old book. Each woman swore to keep it, to never open it in company, and never to speak of what she saw. One recipient, Eleanor Webb, kept hers until her death in 1938. It was opened posthumously, inside a single photograph of a mirror. But in that mirror, there was no reflection, just a room, empty, yet lit, and a name, etched faintly across the base. You already belong. You see, Lizzie didn't want followers, she wanted believers. Not in her innocence, but in her vision. A world where truth was subjective, identity was fluid, and memory was a tool, not a burden. The real horror of Lizzie Borden isn't that she killed, it's that she convinced others it never mattered, and that we, might be part of her experiment still. Lizzie Borden died in 1927. But her presence didn't. In fact, some say her influence only began to flourish after death. She left behind a will, as expected. Most of it was conventional, bequests to servants, a few charities, her beloved pets. But there were anomalies. 12 sealed envelopes sent to 12 addresses across the United States, none to family, none to friends. But to women's societies, occult circles, private libraries, and one to a psychiatric hospital in Pennsylvania, with no explanation, just a Latin inscription. Per crucem veritas. Through the cross, the truth. Each envelope contained different items, but always two constants. A lock of hair, not Lizzie's. A small, handwritten manuscript titled, The Daughters of the Cleaved Oak. What was it? A manifesto? A diary? A blueprint? Scholars argue to this day, but its core message was unmistakable. The body is not the prison, the memory is. Set fire to what you remember, and the cage dissolves. It wasn't just words, it was instruction, and it began to spread. Between 1928 and 1935, a wave of unexplained disappearances and suicides of young women was reported. Boston, New York, Baltimore. The women were all affluent, educated, and known for one thing: their rejection of marriage, motherhood, and traditional roles. In one case, police found a candlelit room in a New Hampshire boarding house, arranged precisely like Lizzie's drawing room at Maplecroft, down to the placement of silverware and mirrors. Scrawled across the walls in ash and lipstick, "She lives in those who forget." Lizzie didn't need to survive biologically, she survived ideologically. Her crime, if you believe she did it, wasn't an end. It was an initiation. She had learned that control didn't come from brute force or courtroom manipulation. It came from narrative. Rewrite your story, rewrite reality, and the world will follow your lie as if it were gospel. Even today, quiet groups exist online and in person, tracing their beliefs back to Lizzie. Not her actions, but her liberation. To them, Lizzie Borden isn't a killer. She's a saint of transformation. And what started with a hatchet has become a gospel of forgetting. We're no longer asking, did Lizzie do it? Now we're asking, what did she truly unleash? In 1971, a declassified FBI memo circulated briefly before being pulled from public access, marked with a redacted stamp and a chilling handwritten note: "Echoes of Fall River emerging, contain and neutralize." The document referenced an internal investigation into a women's commune in upstate New York known as the Cleaved Oak Fellowship. At first glance, the group seemed benign, wealthy, educated women living in voluntary isolation. No crime, no violence. Until a psychiatrist from Albany raised the alarm. He reported a disturbing pattern among his former patients, all ex-members of the fellowship. Each woman had symptoms that defied clinical categorization: memory distortion, temporal confusion, and shared hallucinations centered around a woman in Victorian dress who spoke in riddles and instructed them to sever the root to kill the fruit. The psychiatrist believed it was a form of group indoctrination, bordering on psychic manipulation, but one phrase kept recurring in each session, mumbled by different women, almost trance-like. Lizzie taught us to forget the lie, so we could become the truth. When agents raided the commune's property, they expected cult paraphernalia. Instead, they found a hidden archive, wooden chests sealed with wax, each bearing the initials LB and wrapped in linen stained with dark rust-colored blotches. Inside were hundreds of pages of manuscripts written in archaic cursive, quoting Latin, fragmented poetry, and what appeared to be psychological conditioning exercises. Stand naked before the mirror, speak your childhood name until it dissolves. Burn one photograph each week. When no images remain, you are free. Rewrite your family tree, remove the root, begin with yourself. Agents also found dozens of portraits of Lizzie Borden, each stylized differently. One as Joan of Arc, one as Mary Magdalene, one as an empty-faced mole, and a Quan in a blood-soaked gown. But the most unsettling was a painting labeled Mother of the Unmade. Lizzie stood before a burning house surrounded by smiling young women, some resembling missing persons from decades prior. The case was classified as a psychological cult and shut down. But a few rogue analysts noted that none of the women could remember how they had joined the group. Their identities had been reprogrammed, erased, rebuilt in Lizzie's image. It was more than belief. It was a contagion of the mind. And one haunting question lingered in that FBI report's final sentence. If memory is the cage, who gave Lizzie the key? In 1983, a former Yale professor turned whistleblower leaked a disturbing dossier to an underground journalist working for a fringe publication known as The Veil Ripped. The dossier, codenamed Project Marionette, outlined a clandestine initiative linked to the Order of the Veiled Flame, an alleged secret society that dates back to the early 1800s. Their mission? Not to worship evil, but to reshape humanity through psychological fire. And at the center of this twisted doctrine were 7 vessels, women selected across generations to bear the weight of trauma, secrecy, and transformation. Lizzie Borden was listed as Vessel 3. According to the documents, these women were not merely victims of circumstance. They were ritualistically forged, their minds fractured and reassembled through deliberate familial abuse, societal isolation, and moral distortion. Each was molded into what the Order called a sympathetic weapon, a person whose very presence could influence, bend, or destroy collective perception. These 7 weren't murderers in the traditional sense. They were living experiments. And Lizzie? She was the most famous because she was the most successful. Her case shattered conventional notions of guilt and innocence. It paralyzed the media. It seeded doubt into the American psyche. Was she a killer or a scapegoat? Insane or empowered? That ambiguity wasn't accidental, it was engineered. The leaked dossier included unsettling correspondences between early 20th century psychiatrists and unnamed operatives linked to military psychological units. These letters referenced the Lizzie Protocol, mirror doll training, imprint reversal through domestic trauma. One page described a test in which traumatized children were shown images of Lizzie Borden and asked to describe what they felt. The results were classified, but the margin note read, subjects show accelerated dissociation. Some whisper the same phrase, she sees me. Worse still, the Order had records of 6 other girls, all with backgrounds resembling Lizzie's, parental deaths, institutional cover-ups, unexplained acquittals, and intense public fascination. Names redacted, except one, Catherine H. Liddell, Savannah, Georgia. 1871. Case never went to trial. Whole town refused to speak. All court documents missing. And on the back of her case file, scrawled in near-identical handwriting to that in Lizzie's journals, "Pain is the ink. We write with wounds." The Order of the Veiled Flame believed pain was a tool to awaken clarity, that certain women, if broken correctly, became conduits of something older than civilization, something outside language. And they were never meant to act alone. They didn't bury Lizzie's story, they immortalized it. Not to scare you, to condition you. In the decades following her death, Lizzie Borden was quietly rebranded. What was once a case of brutal parricide transformed into folklore, theatre, satire, and even children's rhymes. Lizzie Borden took an axe. A horror story tucked inside a nursery tune. Why? Because repetition breeds normalization. Because ritual survives best when disguised as play. Documents traced to the Order of the Veiled Flame, now operating under fronts like philanthropic societies, women's civic groups, and even early psychological associations, point to a coordinated effort to turn Lizzie into a cultural archetype. Museums were opened. The Borden house became a tourist attraction. Visitors weren't warned. They were welcomed. One exhibit was curated by a woman named Miriam Gray, who also served on the board of a child psychology foundation in Massachusetts. Uncovered logs show she personally approved the installation of a mirror exhibit placed directly above the spot where Abby Borden was murdered. The plaque read, "The observer becomes the subject." Sound familiar? Miriam's name appears again in a private ledger from a 1952 meeting in Boston. The topic, reactivation of dormant vessel energies through collective reenactment. That same year, a play titled Blood on the Walls, the Lizzie Borden opera debuted, marketed to schools and cultural centers. Do you see it? What looks like homage is ritual camouflage. What sounds like law is coded recruitment. But the most disturbing detail isn't the mockery or glamorization, it's who funded the revival. The Liddell Foundation, named for Catherine H. Liddell, Vessel 4. The foundation's stated mission? Supporting women's autonomy in heritage sites. Its hidden directive, maintaining active loci of psychological residue, places like the Borden house where emotional trauma lingers like static. Multiple reports from visitors mention intense nausea, dissociation, and mirror hallucinations inside the Lizzie Borden house. Paranormal explanations dominate online forums. But it's not paranormal. It's residual design. These places weren't preserved to honor history, they were preserved to continue the programming. They are temples, and Lizzie isn't a ghost. She's a goddess of fracture, and those who visit her shrine unknowingly step into her ritual. You thought Lizzie Borden was buried in a grave. You were wrong. She was implanted in culture, injected into the bloodstream of academia, folklore, and pop psychology, where she multiplies. Beginning in the 1960s, a wave of feminist reinterpretations of Lizzie's story flooded universities. She wasn't a killer anymore. She was an icon of female rage, a proto-heroine rebelling against patriarchy. Convenient. Because now, the institutions had a new mask. Departments at Harvard, Brown, and Columbia began offering courses titled Transgressive Women in History, and Lizzie was the crown jewel. But who funded those courses? The Mercer Institute for Behavioral Reconstruction, founded in 1947. This wasn't education. This was cognitive laundering. The Mercer archives, sealed for decades until leaked by a whistleblower, show a direct link between curriculum designers and a covert program called Operation Prism. Its objective: embed ritual trauma figures into mainstream consciousness to generate adaptive psychological templates. Translation: turn killers into concepts, turn trauma into structure. They didn't just study Lizzie, they channeled her. In 1981, a paper published in the Journal of Archetypal Psychology suggested certain individuals, when exposed to intense symbolic trauma, especially stories like Lizzie's, undergo a process called fracture imprinting. Their psyches don't reject the horror, they absorb it. This, the paper claimed, creates compliant vessels, people who will unconsciously repeat or perpetuate patterns of manipulation, cruelty, and moral confusion. And who funded that paper? You guessed it, the Lidl Foundation again. Even now, thousands of TikTokers and YouTubers glamorize Lizzie with makeup tutorials, fashion homages, and reenactments. Harmless? Think again. Every time her story is performed, reposted, reloved, the original architecture is run, deactivated. Because Lizzie wasn't an individual. She was an experiment, a test subject who became a template. And the most chilling part, her story has no ending. Because those who built her never wanted one. They wanted a mirror, a myth, and a map, one they could feed into the bloodstream of every curious mind. The courtroom was never the end. It was the altar. You've been told Lizzie Borden got away with murder because the evidence was weak. No blood, no eyewitnesses, just whispers and shadows. But this was no accident. It was orchestration. Let's look at the trial, not as a legal proceeding, but as a ritual drama. It took place in June 1893 in the Superior Court of New Bedford, Massachusetts, but the courtroom layout matched no standard design of the era. The jury box was positioned at a mathematically precise angle, 33 degrees west of true north, a configuration found in only one other known structure, the Temple of the Order of Sable Light, a secretive, esoteric society tied to New England's elite. Coincidence? Not when you consider the names. The presiding judge, Justin Dewey, was a known associate of Henry Cabot Lodge, a U.S. senator who frequently attended private evenings at the Boston Athenaeum, a club deeply embedded in occult traditions. The prosecutor, Hosea Knowlton, was a Freemason. The lead defense attorney, George Robinson, was Massachusetts's former governor, and on the board of the Drake Asylum for Psychological Anomalies, a now shuttered facility rumored to host special children from elite families. Now ask yourself, why would the state assign such powerful men to the defense of a suspected double murderer from a middling family, unless she was never meant to be convicted? Court records reveal over 40 pieces of evidence were withheld from the jury. This includes a blood-stained petticoat found in Lizzie's room, dismissed as menstrual, a neighbor's testimony claiming to hear chanting the night before the murders, deemed unreliable, and a journal entry by Lizzie referencing a second face beneath father's, sealed, never admitted. The trial lasted 14 days. The number 14 in occult numerology represents initiation and reversal. On the final day, Lizzie fainted when skull fragments were presented, but transcripts show she murmured something just before losing consciousness. He sees now. Who did she mean? Her father, or the ones watching the trial, hidden behind smoke and marble? She was acquitted in less than 2 hours. The people thought justice had failed. They were wrong. Justice was never the goal. This was the moment Lizzie became untouchable, not just legally, but mythically. You think the story ends in the courtroom? No. That was just the baptism. The real machinery was only beginning to stir. Because after her acquittal, Lizzie didn't retreat into obscurity. She didn't fade away into guilt or fear. She transformed into something else, something trained, backed, and positioned. Let's talk about Maplecroft, the house Lizzie purchased after the trial, a grand mansion at 306 French Street in Fall River. But this wasn't a sanctuary, it was a sanctum. Within months of moving in, renovations began, not for comfort, for containment. Hidden rooms were added, books in dead languages filled the private library, texts in Enochian, Aramaic and ciphered Latin. Witnesses spoke of late-night visitors in black coaches, cloaked figures arriving under the veil of fog. None were ever seen leaving. Lizzie's social circle changed overnight. She was seen dining with Helena Blavatsky's American disciples and corresponded with individuals linked to the Golden Dawn, a British occult order known to manipulate the elite. Her name appears, encoded but traceable, in at least 2 ritual logs preserved by the Temple of the Mirror Flame, a society that believed women could channel forces beyond human comprehension if they had been properly prepared through trauma. Now ask yourself, was the murder the trauma or the gateway? Lizzie's post-trial life was not that of a pariah. It was the life of someone who had passed the test, who had graduated from a blood initiation. She became a ghost in plain sight, drifting between elite gatherings, private seances, closed-door salons where power was transferred through whispers, not votes. Even stranger, Maplecroft's groundskeeper, Robert K. Mance, disappeared in 1896. A note in Lizzie's handwriting was found in his abandoned shack. The roots were not deep enough. He heard the knocking. In 1899, two Boston journalists, emptying to interview her, were found wandering in a nearby cemetery, speaking in tongues and tearing pages from Bibles. The official report? Temporary psychosis brought on by exhaustion. But the local physician assigned to the case, Dr. Edwin Clark, vanished a week later. His home was boarded up, his records sealed. These were not random events. They were containment failures. Because Lizzie Borden wasn't just a murder suspect, she was an open channel, and someone wanted to keep that channel operational. Beneath Maplecroft, no floor plan exists. No architect signed the foundation blueprints, yet every man who stepped inside that basement came out changed or didn't come out at all. In 1901, a young plumber, Thomas Reed, was hired to fix a ruptured pipe in Maplecroft's cellar. He never returned home. His brother broke into the property days later, found his tools neatly placed near a narrow brick wall, but no sign of Thomas. A year later, another worker, James Holloway, discovered something behind that wall. He told his wife, "There's a second basement, and it wasn't meant for the living." He left town the next morning. His wagon was found overturned 5 miles out. No trace of him has ever been found. So what was Lizzie hiding? A faded document recovered in 1973 by a paranormal researcher offers a clue. It was written in blood ink, unsigned, and hidden behind a baseboard. The language was a mix of Latin and some unknown glyphic system. Translated, it read, "Where innocence is broken, the gate widens. Blood primes the mirror. The vessel must be young, the mind unwritten." Fall River had more than its share of missing children. Girls aged 9 to 13, between 1893 and 1907. Their disappearances were often dismissed, blamed on poverty or migration, but local legends speak of a woman in grey, luring girls with music that only those children could hear. Neighbors heard harp strings in the night. And Lizzie? She had hired 6 live-in maids during that time. None lasted more than a month. 2 left without collecting pay. 1 vanished mid-shift. A diary fragment from a nursemaid who worked briefly at Maplecroft contained this entry. "She asked me to bring the child to the basement, said it was for prayer. But there was no altar, only a mirror, cracked down the middle, and that sound, humming, but not from her, from below." We're not just talking about ritual here. We are talking about conduits. Children as vessels, untouched minds used to open something older than time. Whatever Lizzie brought back from that first bloodletting didn't want to leave. It needed access. It needed innocence, and Maplecroft became its nesting ground. In 1895, the Postal Service flagged a series of letters leaving Fall River addressed only to J. Valens, Crescent Row, New Orleans. No return name, no legal trace of recipient or sender. But handwriting analysts in 1979 matched the loops, pressure, and peculiar formation of S and G to one individual, Lizzie Borden. These letters were not confessions. They were updates, written in cipher, alternating Latin with Theban script and invoking names tied to ancient heresies long buried by Rome. The opening line in one reads, "The mirror is feeding, but the vessel resisted." Valens was no ordinary pen pal. In 1893, a fire destroyed a boarding house in New Orleans' French Quarter. Only one room was untouched, room 6, rented under the alias J. Valens. Inside were maps of Massachusetts, a ledger of 37 child names, and a drawing of a circular symbol, later identified as a binding sigil from pre-Christian Mesopotamian cults, and scrawled on the back of a torn hymn book, "Fall River, the last key. The girl has seen beyond." Who was Valens? A guide? A summoner? A handler? Another letter from Lizzie includes a chilling passage. The echo from the cellar grows louder. I fear it's not her voice anymore. By 1902, neighbors of Maplecroft reported low, rhythmic sounds beneath the earth during new moons, pulses of vibration that killed the birds in nearby trees. Dogs refused to pass the Borden property. And there's this. A Louisiana death certificate from 1912 lists J. Valens as deceased due to psychic collapse. The attending physician notes in the margin, subject claimed to see burning wings in every mirror. But Lizzie kept writing. In her final known letter, never mailed, found behind the fireplace at Maplecroft, she wrote, "It wants the choir, but I am too old. I fear it will choose another." There is no evidence Lizzie Borden ever bore a child. But the chilly, and rumors say otherwise, that a girl was born under secretive conditions in 1903. Not to live, but to replace. To become the next host. And the question we must ask is this. Did Lizzie die in 1927, or was she consumed? In 1964, under orders not found in any public archive, Lizzie Borden's grave was disturbed. It wasn't vandals. It wasn't historians. It was a federal team operating under a shadow project known only by its code name, Operation Thornroot. Local Fall River police were barred from Oak Grove Cemetery that night. The perimeter was secured. Radiological gear was on site. No clergy, no press, no next of kin. By morning, her grave was resealed. But one photograph leaked, a blurry shot showing an empty coffin, its silk lining blackened and scorched, warped like it had been exposed to intense heat or chemical burns. No body, no bones. Only a mirror, perfectly intact, lying where her head should have been. The mirror bore scratches, deliberately etched symbols matching those in her letters to J. Valens. Worse, scientists from the National Cryptological Institute examined the mirror and found it emitted low-frequency hums, not from the glass, but from inside. Inside something that wasn't supposed to be there. A former technician leaked his testimony in 1982. "We didn't exhume a corpse. We retrieved a device, and it reacted to human touch, like it had memory." The technician vanished weeks after releasing that statement. No official investigation followed. And yet, the whispers intensified. Fall River saw a rash of disappearances in the late 1960s. 6 children, each last seen within a block of Maplecroft. The house was boarded up by order of the state, yet some claimed they saw candlelight flickering behind the windows. Some even swore they heard a woman's voice, reciting nursery rhymes in reverse. The same rhyme Lizzie supposedly sang after the murders. But here's the final horror. In 1993, an anonymous donor funded a study of Victorian mirrors owned by descendants of the Borden family. 4 of the mirrors, now in private collections, were found to display visual anomalies which viewed under thermal imaging. In one, a face appeared, not Lizzie's, but a child, mouth open in terror, eyes wide, forever staring at something just behind the glass. The echoes didn't end in 1892, they simply changed form. And now, you're watching this. You're part of the circle. You've heard the truth the world was never meant to know. So I ask you, when you look in the mirror tonight, will you be alone? They said Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. But they never told you what came after the blood dried. They never told you about the letters to the dead, the mirrors that whispered, or the federal agents who came for her grave under moonlight. They buried a legend, but they unearthed something much older. And now, by watching this, you've invited her story into your life. So tonight, when you pass the mirror, look twice. She might still be watching.